more war. We've had so many more wars. I have to record myself here. We have so many more wars that it's kind of, like in Newport, for example, there's the boots on the ground that people put out for folks. And I'm not being oppositional to that at all. I'm just saying, I'm just trying to bring us back to the Civil War generation. So we have to appreciate those who were traumatized by the war. And so not only the soldiers, but so many people lost their loved ones who were dear to them. So I want to share some history. And throughout this, I'll mention 4 ways that I think that Memorial Day matters. Everything I say basically is based on the work of Drew Gilpin Faust, a Harvard historian. She was president of Harvard for a while. And her book is called This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War. There's also a wonderful DVD by Rick Burns, Ken Burns' brother, called Death in the Civil War. And there are lots of copies of the book and many copies of the DVD in the Rhode Island library system, if any of you want to pursue that further. Even Drew at one point said that even though she was a historian, when she thought of the Civil War, it would be about battles and heroes and Lincoln and emancipation. But really, as she did more research, she realized when she read letters and diaries from people of the time that really what the Civil War was about death, and that there was a tremendous work involved with death. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The current estimates are that 750,000 people died in the Civil War. I think that's mainly military people. And that would be the equivalent of 7 million people today if we were to compare our population in the 1860s to 2020, the 2020s, let's say. Or, yeah, just about now. So that if you think so, 7 million. And just to put that in perspective, compare it to the 3,000 plus who died on 9/11, or the slightly less than 600,000 who now in the US have died, or the 3.53 million. So 7 million percentage-wise of us compared to 3.53 million people worldwide who've died from the COVID pandemic. Again, these are numbers and estimates. So it was big. It was big. It was total. It was very traumatic. Both the North and the South thought the Civil War was going to be very brief. Lincoln's first conscription of soldiers was for 90 days, and the North thought, well, we are stronger and we're industrial, we'll win this pretty quickly. The South, proud of its military and cavalry tradition, thought, you know what, we'll push these Northerners back and they'll leave us alone and we can secede and have slavery and that'll be that. Well, it turns out that the war was, to use a phrase, a great American carnage from the very first battle at Bull Run in 1861. And partly why it was so traumatic, what I want to explain is that what the amount of death and how it happened compared to what 19th century, and I'm going to say white Americans, were used to. I think we all know that the Native Americans and the African Americans had different stories. But for Caucasians, people, a lot of people died, children died. It's not that death was a stranger, but there was a very strong notion of and desire for a good death. And a good death means that one would die amid one's family. There was time for last words. people dying could make amends with others. They could reconcile themselves to dying, connect with their maker. And part of what people believed, I didn't realize this, but they really believed that by dying in this way, and then especially being also buried in a family plot, that this was part of what would bring people together in heaven. So what happened when there was all of a sudden violent and many, many deaths in the Civil War, the trauma just blew people apart. You know, the 19th century death culture also had a culture of mourning. People had special clothes, there was prescribed mourning periods. Women went into heavy mourning when they wore black, and then lighter mourning when, you know, the clothing faded to, I think it was sort of like mauve, like a gray mauve kind of color. It was a very different world, and none of that was possible. So I guess the first way that I would say war matters and that Memorial Day matters is because for the Civil War generation, that war was their Holocaust. And I certainly know, you know, from where we all sit in history, how the Holocaust sits for us. And I'm very conscious about how this war sat for them. So what made the Civil War so brutal? Of course, new technologies, rifles that all of a sudden were better. People could fire the bullets faster. The shooting was more accurate. And yet people could still see when they killed someone. You know, if I killed someone, my enemy, I could see that person die, and I could see the enemy who shot my buddy at the same time. So it was personal and a lot more violent. In addition, armies were larger, less well-trained. And of course, I have to mention that, like in all wars, disease and poor hygiene killed more people than actually the war. And just even the massing and movements of troops brought so much disease. And you know about, I'm sure you've all seen those pictures of the limbs from people who had surgery and surgeons who didn't yet understand germ theory enough to really invade people's bodies without real cleanliness. And with so much death, even though that was the case, the understanding was that death was still a family affair. So there was no organized military response. There was no systemic infrastructure. There was no ambulance corps to gather people who were wounded or dying or injured or dead. There were no organized burying procedures. There were no cemeteries set up, and there were no ways to identify people. So, you know, we're used to dog tags and you know, that we have that expectation. There was none of that. So everything was improvised in the field. And so sometimes soldiers would bury their comrades. And again, this was amid a lot of killing, so a lot of people did not get buried. So there would be stories where some of the men would carry letters, say from their families. So if they got killed and someone buried them, they could notify their next of kin, like that they had been injured or that they were dead. Men were buried with bottles sometimes with their names in a piece of paper. And later on, after the war, when the bodies were reinterred, this was crucial for identification. So it was horrible. One story, I guess what I want to say is, so some people were buried, but many bodies were left on battlefields till after the war, and there were bodies left on the roadways everywhere. There was a 1,000-mile theater of war that was full of bodies after 1865. One story, you know, there are many stories here. Henry Bowditch was a father of Nathaniel Bowditch. Bow Ditch. He was a Northerner. He had gotten in 1863 a telegram that his son had been seriously wounded. The telegram said, "Danger, come at once." But when he got down to the battlefield, Nathaniel was dead. And Henry was just devastated that there was not even an ambulance corps. And actually, through his work, by the end of 1864, there was a rudimentary ambulance corps in some cases on some battlefields due to his efforts. Also at that time, there's just so much diversity. Some bodies did get shipped to the north and south, or the south, to their homes by train, and often those bodies became putrid and stank. So this really brought embalming to the fore, and so families would hire embalmers to come down and to the battlefields to embalm bodies. So while you had some corpses just strewn, you also had these attempts by families to bring their loved ones home. It was a very diverse situation. And sometimes the local people became scavengers and just went on the field after battle to steal what they could, to cut out pockets, so some, with people's possessions. And I had this image of what would it be like to be a really wounded person, and to see these people gathering on the fields like vultures, taking things from my comrades. Of course, those people were also devastated by the war. They may very well have been farmers or villagers whose stores were taken by an invading army. So, war. So just to get a little specific here, there were 5 battlefield cemeteries created during the war, and one was at Gettysburg. So just, we all think about Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg took place over 3 days, July 1st through the 3rd in 1863. In those 3 days, 22,000 soldiers were wounded, 700 men were killed, and 3,000 horses died. 3 days. And one soldier said that there were so many bodies that when he walked across the whole field, his feet never touched the earth, because he just walked across the field on dead people and animals. So of 22,000 wounded and 10,000 dead creatures, this happened in a town of 2,400 people. So between the army, this was the Union Army that had won that battle, and the townspeople, those were the ones who were left to deal with all of this. And the stench was so bad that one report said that people were using peppermint oil to their, and holding it up to their faces for the smell up until frost. So finally in October, this is October 1863, the battlefield, 17 acres in town were bought, and then the bodies were starting to be buried. Now, Lincoln came to the battlefield in November, so still, only 1 month later. Lincoln did not give the Gettysburg Address in some beautifully manicured field with beautiful headstones. In fact, this was raw ground with still open graves, probably still the smell of death in the air, and this is where he was. I want to go to the Gettysburg Address again. Hang on. And, I want to highlight some of the words. If the dead gave their lives so our nation could live, Memorial Day commemorates this new birth of freedom. So one historian, Vincent Brown, talks about how the dead had now become conscripted to political work. In other words, our nation, let me read this, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Just as Larry said during Joys and Concerns, this was not a given. This was a new consecration, and the death gave us that mandate. And so that's the second reason that Memorial Day matters. After the war, the real full burial process had to happen. And I really won't go on about this, but let me just say 74 cemeteries were created, 303,000 soldiers were interred in these cemeteries. They were reburied from other places. And of those 303,000, 54% were identified. Of those soldiers, about 30,000 were African Americans, and only a third of them were identified. And throughout this whole procedure, and there's so much interesting history about this, Black soldiers did a lot of the real dirty work. And, this happened, up through 1948 when the military was really integrated. So even though the soldiers did this work and were part of the Union Army in the cemeteries, they were buried in a segregated section. So everything is uneven. There's a whole lot of interesting history about how these dead were identified. Lists were published. Clara Barton was involved. But I am going to skip this. I do want to say, though, that a third, I guess, reason that I think Memorial Day matters is because of the role of African Americans. Now, one of I don't know exactly how to say this, these cemeteries were only for Union soldiers, so of course there were Southerners who died. 20% of the Civil War generation in the South were killed, men of that generation. 1/5 of all of them were killed. And the South, which was impoverished, took note that the $4 million that the federal government spent and the 4 years of effort up through 1871 that the Union was burying Northern dead did not include the South. So what happened to the South? Actually, what happened was that ladies' auxiliaries were formed to bring their men home. And in the Rick Burns film, a female voice came on with the following sentences. These men will no longer sleep alone. Their isolated repose has been interrupted by the gentle hands of their country women, and they are now home with us. So one of the things I notice, and I think about the rifts in our own country, and as historians have pointed out, the people of the South lost a war that they wanted to win, and they did not get the country that they wanted with perpetual slavery. But still, I often wonder how much they were embittered by this, the fact that their death were ignored when supposedly we were a reunited country. So that to me is like a fourth reason to honor Memorial Day. You might want to know about the history of Memorial Day, and let me just say a few things. In 1868, General Logan officially declared Memorial Day for May 30th, and Memorial Day was a northern holiday on May 30th from 1868 to 1970, when it became this federal, last Monday in May kind of holiday. There were earlier commemorations or decorations of graves. Southern people, especially Southern women, throughout the Civil War, even as early as 1861, would honor the dead and with flowers on graves when there were graves there. Waterloo, New York was in 1966 was designated the birthplace of Memorial Day, Decoration Day, because of ceremonies they had. However, David Blight, that's an interesting name, Blight, B-L-I-G-H-T, a Yale historian, found an interesting account that I want to share with you from Charlestown. This is from Charleston, North Carolina. Am I saying it? South Carolina, sorry. And what happened was there was a race course in Charleston, South Carolina was one of the places where the Civil War began. And there was a race course there that had been made into a prison of Northern soldiers. But in 1865, the whites fled and the African Americans were left. Most of them were former slaves. And so they conducted a commemoration of the dead. So during the final year of the war, the Confederates had converted their racehorse track to a prison and jockey club. Union soldiers were kept in horrible conditions in the interior of the track. At least 257 died of exposure and disease and were hastily buried. In April of 1865, 28 blacks reinterred these people, put them in individual graves, and they whitewashed the fence, built an archway over the entrance, and inscribed the words, "Martyrs of the Race Course." So in 1865, they had a Memorial Day celebration. And I'm going to read to you about this, and I'll end here. At 9 a.m. on May 1st, that was the date then, the procession stepped off, led by 3,000 black school children carrying armloads of roses singing John Brown's Body. The children were followed by several hundred black women with baskets of flowers, wreaths, and crosses. Then came black men marching in cadence, followed by contingents of Union infantry and other black and white citizens. As many as possible gathered in the cemetery. A children's choir sang, "America will rally around the flag and the Star-Spangled Banner," as well as black spirituals. This was followed by military drills, and then they all gathered, enjoyed picnics, listened to speeches, and watched the soldiers drill. By 1880, those bodies of the Northern soldiers were moved to a cemetery called Beaufort Cemetery. But this too was a Memorial Day celebration. So when you wonder about the history, that's it. And there's a lot more. And if anyone wants to go further, connect with me and I'll give you those resources.